Good morning. As the king of Israel, at the zenith of its power and influence, Solomon had the opportunity and the resources to pursue the rewards of pleasure and work. His wisdom ensured that he would be honest about his findings, and his reflections are recorded for us in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. There's some very interesting things to say about a number of things, but we're looking at what he has to say about happiness. And this morning, that will bring us to consider what does he say about happiness and those of us who work in a workaday world. Talk about the labor of happiness. There's a sheet in your worship folder, if you want to allude to it. Let me tell you, let's read together what he says, Ecclesiastes 5:18 through 20. He says, "Then I realized that it is good and proper for a man to eat and drink, to find satisfaction in his toilsome labor under the sun, during the few days of life God has given him, for this is his lot. Moreover, when God gives any man wealth and possessions and enables him to enjoy them, to accept his lot, and to be happy in his work, this is a gift of God. He seldom reflects on the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with gladness of heart." Solomon looks around at those who are engaged in toilsome labor under the sun, and he almost seems to enviously acknowledge those who earn a living, enjoy the fruit of hard work, and are happy in what they do. We might call it blue-collar happiness. He looks around and say, you're very fortunate. You go to work, you're occupied in your work, and you don't and are not preoccupied with what's happening around you. There's blue-collar happiness, but at another level, there seems to be something close to ignorance is bliss. There seems to be an element of that as well, like a horse with blinders on. The man who whistles while he works seldom reflects on the days of his life. People who enjoy their work are protected from seeing, in Solomon's eyes, how aimless life is. And it's a very odd thing. He talks so much about happiness, yet this is a book that's kind of melancholy in a way. Life under the sun for Solomon seems meaningless. He talks about it as being a chasing after wind. You've ever chased the wind, it's kind of a fruitless pursuit, trying to chase your tail. Solomon wistfully acknowledges that from this perspective, under the sun, just on the basis of what you see, life doesn't make much sense. That's what he ends up saying. It's important to remember that at this place in salvation history, there's no clear view of eternity in the Old Testament. There's a couple allusions to it, but by and large, people believed that you die, and that's it. That's what happens under the sun. You die, you work, you die, that's it. David expressed this in the Psalms, "No one remembers you when he is dead. Who praises you from the grave?" And again, there's some allusions to eternity, but that's kind of the way they believed. There wasn't enough belief in any kind of eternity to offset the fact that you go to the ground and that's it. It was Jesus who brings life and immortality out of the shadows and into the light. It was Jesus that did that. Before that, immortality lay in shadow. Jesus came, and all of a sudden, it's in bright daylight. And it was Jesus who did that, and the unveiling of immortality changes everything, especially on a day like today, Memorial Day. Jesus radically, eternally, unequivocally impacted the way we view death and dying. When we remember Nate today, we will remember him far differently because of what Jesus had to reveal about what happens on the far side of the grave. Carrie Dolge, mother, passed away. The fact of what Jesus has to say drastically impacts the way that family will deal with the passing of a mother. Jesus said when he was speaking to Mary and Martha, their brother Lazarus had died, what he said, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha answered, I know he'll rise again on the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever believes in me will never die. What he was indicating, Jesus did, he brought immortality out into the light. And it's indicated that that's the way things are. And then he asked you a question. I'll ask you to respond to this, maybe not out loud, but in silence. But here's what Jesus said. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And he who lives and believes in me will never die. And Jesus asked, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Jesus changed the way we view death and dying. We can no longer see it the same. Can you imagine dealing with death without believing this? Can you imagine dealing with Memorial Day without there being life on the far side of the grave? This is the world Solomon lived in. And from that perspective, we can understand, can't we? Why life looked meaningless under the sun. People work, they leave things, and they're gone. Vanished. They no longer exist. And for Solomon, this is the world he lived in. This is what most people believe. Looking at death from above the sun, looking at death from above the sun, from God's perspective, makes a huge difference. Would you agree? Looking at work from above the sun makes a huge difference as well. Looking at work from God's perspective surfaces some unemployment concerns and employment benefits. Let's scan a few of them. Unemployment concerns. Fortunately, we live in a part of the country reasonably well protected from unemployment. Even when unemployment was skyrocketing in this part of the country, it wasn't as bad as in other places. If you've dealt with unemployment, though, you know how challenging it is to want to work and not be able to do so. Some of you understand that very well. Bills are piling up. You want to work. You want to join the labor force, but you can't for one reason or another. You can think of a number of employment concerns, but in the Bible, it talks about unemployment concerns from a spiritual perspective. Let's zero in on some sacred concerns. Look what Paul writes, 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 12. Paul writes, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers, to keep away from every brother who is idle and does not live according to the teaching you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this not because we do not have the right to such help, but in order to make ourselves a model for you to follow. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. We hear that some among you are idle. They are not busy, they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down, eat the bread they earn, the bread they eat. Idle, when it says some of you are idle, it has a sense of disorderly, chaotic. The disorder defined by the paragraph is loafing, being remiss in daily work and conduct. And there's a reason for this. It's not that they couldn't work. It's not that there weren't any jobs. There's a reason that they chose not to work. It was tied in with their expectation that the second coming of Christ was right around the corner. Jesus talked about a generation will pass before I'll come again. And they believed, well, okay, you see, Jesus is going to come any minute now. And therefore, they justified not working with the rationale that Jesus was coming and there were a lot better things to do than work. When Paul was with these followers of Christ, he tried to set an example for hard work, and he did work hard. He was a tent maker by trade, Paul was. And the way that worked, tents were made from goat's hair or dark sheep's wool. They were woven into rectangular strips on large looms and then sewn together. Interestingly enough, it was a trade that both men and women were involved in and could be seen as part of their vocation, the way they earned a living. The way it worked in Paul's time when he was a Jewish kid, Jewish Roman kid, is you began to learn a trade about age 13. So that's the point at which he would have learned to take these rectangular pieces of wool, sometimes leather, from where Paul was from in Tarsus. They had linen. That's where they made linen. And so you'd take these strips and you'd take awls and needles and you'd sew these things together to make large tents that nomadic people used in their travels in the wilderness. Sometimes they used as awnings in houses. By the time Paul was 15 or 16, he would have learned this trade. He would have known how to make tents. And there was an apprenticeship, and at the end of an apprenticeship, the way it worked is you were given the tools. So he would have been age 13, done this for 2 or 3 years, gotten the tools. The thing that made this kind of nifty is the knives and awls would have made tent making an easily portable trade. You could carry them in a satchel and move from place to place and earn a living, and that's what Paul did. Again, women wove the fabric for the tent, stitched them together, and kept them in good repair. Women were very active, and it's interesting that Paul would have engaged in a trade, or can I say, God would have led Paul to engage in a trade that would bring him into contact not only with other male laborers, but female laborers as well. Priscilla and Aquila were a couple Paul spent a lot of time with in Corinth and Ephesus, and what we learned, both of them were tent makers. And so Paul rubbed shoulders with both men and women. That's why they were so much a part of his ministry. But apparently, when Paul tried to give this example about hard work, and he didn't take advantage of a right he had as a teacher to earn a living from what he taught. He taught that that was the way it is, but he chose not to avail himself of that opportunity, but worked. He made tents, sold them, and then lived off of the proceeds of that. They didn't pick up on his model. Again, they cited spiritual reasons, the people in Thessalonica, for being idle. Working seemed so boring and unspiritual compared to activities that were directly associated with Jesus coming. I mean, let's not waste our time working. Jesus could come any minute. They probably spent a lot of time in church praying for one another, even announcing that Christ's return was around the corner. If Jesus was going to come back at any moment, he'd want you to be praying with somebody when you came, wouldn't he? You know, gee, that would stink. Jesus comes back to be working at something. That's kind of the way they felt. And it makes sense from one perspective, doesn't it? Work can seem unspiritual. I mean, it's work. And there's church, and there's work. There's sacred, and then there's secular. And we tend to draw a division between the two. And that's too bad, because Jesus didn't. He said, do all to the glory of God. And work and worship, both things matter to God. Your worship matters to God. But your work matters to God. And it's not that your worship is spiritual and your work is not. With God, motive is everything. Everything done with the motive of wanting to do the best to be able to provide for others is a very spiritual thing. That's what we'll end up seeing. But it's easy to understand, at one perspective, why work seems unspiritual. The only problem is that God wanted them to continue to work. It seems like God's will involves work. Before the fall, God hired Adam to tend the garden. Had work for him to do before sin visited. Now, when sin came, work became a little more difficult. That which both reproduces life, women, and sustains life in terms of bringing up crops out of the ground was associated with painful labor in both ways. But work was part of the deal. There was a saying the time that Paul was around. If a man does not work, he will not eat. And it was just a statement of fact. If a man doesn't work, he doesn't eat. Makes sense, doesn't it? Paul made it a little bit different. If a man doesn't work, he shall not eat. He turned it into a command and acted in that way. Why? Why? Apparently, what was happening, idle hands create, in Thessalonica at least, idle hands were creating busybodies. Idle hands creating busybodies. They were using the extra time to interfere and meddle in other people's affairs. That's what's happening. Paul condemns those whose only business is to be a busybody. Idlers and gossips with nothing better to do. There was a meddlesome kind of spirit happening because they weren't really employed. I mean, you wake up, Jesus could come back today, and what they do is they just kind of mill around with one another and what's happening to her, what's happening to him, and that's what's happening in the church. A bunch of people, you know the way that works, don't you? Don't have to go to work today. What should we do? What did you hear about? And that's what was going on. But it wasn't just a nuisance, though. It wasn't just a nuisance. It was spiritually dangerous. In Ephesus, it became a channel for heresy in the church. It was very difficult to be a widow at those times. Individuals who were widows, there wasn't a lot of welfare in the Roman Empire or the Jewish Empire. So if you were a widow, you hoped you had kids to take care of you. If you didn't, you're in a tough spot. And what was happening, there were younger widows who had a long life ahead, and what was happening, those false teachers who were moving into the church zeroed in on the younger widows and said, boy, that's too bad, you know, and they would cater to them, and they would develop a relationship with them, and they would tell them, did you know, and they would feed them a line that wasn't really in line with the truth, and then they weren't able to be employed, so they had lots of time. And those who fed them these lines knew that. And they would, and it would spread. That's why Paul, it was dangerous. He says, 1 Timothy 5, they get into the habit of being idle, going from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. There's unemployment concerns, idleness, things. There's also employment benefits, though. Look what he says, 1 Thessalonians 4. He says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Not minding their own business was the problem in Thessalonica. Again, it seems that was an ongoing issue in the church. He talks about it in the first letter and the second letter. Mind your own business, as don't just mind other people's business. Do the work you need to do. Be gainfully employed. That's what he wants. And he says that will allow them to win the respect of outsiders. I think what he's saying, in order to win the respect of outsiders, MYOB. That's, mind your own business. Even outsiders recognize and respect hard work and are repelled by those who do not carry their share of social responsibility. And again, it's one thing if you can't work because you're not able to, or there's not work to do. What's happening in this context, they're spiritualizing it. We're too spiritual to work. We're too busy waiting for Jesus to come back to be involved in work. We need to do spiritual things. And again, that reflects a belief that's too bad, that life is divided into sacred and secular. Brother Lawrence talked about practicing the presence of God. And what he determined? He experienced the presence of God while he was washing dishes. There's nothing that we do in terms of unemployment that is not a place that we can connect with God. He cares about where you work. and he cares about what you do. It's not just that, well, now you hear this morning, God says, okay, great. Now you're where I want you to be. I think God would have us to love Sundays and, in as much as we can, love Mondays too. Loving Sundays and Mondays. Both are important to God. So not minding their own business was a problem in Thessalonica. Not taking care of business was a problem in Ephesus. One of the benefits of work is the opportunity to give things. Listen to what Paul says. A couple places, Ephesians, he writes, "He who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with his own hands, that he may have something to share with those who need." There's always a reason. When Paul says work, there's always a reason why. And the work is so that you can share with somebody who is in need. And that was, I guess, an issue in Ephesus. They were so busy being spiritual that they weren't that interested in providing physical things. They'd say, be warm and well fed, but in terms of giving things, that wasn't seen to be as important, not as spiritual. But Paul says it's deeply spiritual. In the Bible, love is very active. Love doesn't just, it's not just an emotional thing. It's a practical thing. And it's the way some show love. 5 love languages. There's different ways we express love. Some of us, and we all speak and understand different languages. There is words. For some of us, words are the way we express and receive love. Touch is important. For some of us, then there's time. For some of us, that is what love means. Love means when somebody takes time with us, like over a weekend like this. We travel and we're together. That, and then there's service. Service is another thing where punching the time clock, day in and day out, in a job that you might not love, but you want the opportunity to be able to leverage the thing that you get to care for those who you care for. And what Paul valued, and God values as well. It's having a very strong statement. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. The Bible is very practical. There were widows in that time who needed to be cared for. And what Paul encouraged, it's not always possible, for practical reasons. I want to be careful. Some of you have parents or grandparents, and caring for parents and grandparents is a very dicey issue. Not in a position all the time to be able to bring them within, yes, there's a number of things, but for spiritual reasons to say, well, I'm too spiritual to be able to care, that doesn't work. That doesn't work, and that's what Paul is getting at in terms of what he says to the Ephesians, and he says, that doesn't work. In as much as you can and are able, take care of parents, take care of grandparents. Let us know exactly what that's like. That matters to God, that you would do so. Returning the care that you have been given, returning that care to those. God takes note of that. It matters to him. Work is not an unspiritual pursuit. Again, this is important to realize because not doing so leads to believing that God is only happy when we're doing spiritual things like praying and reading the Bible, that he's disinterested when we're doing unspiritual things like working. When Jesus was trying to catalyze and cultivate a relationship with Peter, Andrew, James, and John, he appealed to them through their vocation. He used their vocation to show them that he was worth following. Look what it says in Luke 5. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, who was Peter, "Put out into deep water, let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." That's a little sarcasm here, maybe. Because you say so. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So they pulled their boats up on shore and left everything and followed him. Jesus appealed to them in the context of their work. It wasn't in church that he connected with them and became and appealed to them relative to follow me. It was in their vocation. It was in their job. Nothing really spiritual about fishing. But it was where Jesus connected with them, not only in the beginning of his relationship, but at the end. Let me just read. It's not in your worship folder. In John 21, verse 4, it says, "Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore." This is after he had risen and was appearing to them again. Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Jesus revealed himself powerfully in the context of their vocation. Could he do the same today? He appealed to them powerfully in the context of their vocation. Could Jesus meet you where you work? Is work a place you could connect with God? No, work. I work in a bank. I work in a store. I take care of deliveries. I take care of selling and buying. Now, I got some questions. Can God fix a car? Not really good with those screws that are in, the back of the place where you have you got those things. Can God program a computer? Can God solve a space shortage? Can God solve a delivery problem? The answer is, of course he can, but it doesn't seem so, does it? It's hard to see God that way. Not realizing that God cares about your job causes us to disregard calling out to him for help when we're in a tight spot. We miss the opportunity to connect with him. It's a caution. God's priorities might differ from your boss's. He might have a different bottom line. However, it is a context in which you can call out to him. God cares about your work. What would it mean for you? I want you to think. What would it mean for you, not out loud, but to call out to God and think about him, ask him about things when you work? Think about your job. What might you ask God about? What concern do you have? I'm not sure he's going to give you an answer that you'll hear audibly. But it could be that turning your attention to him, you might learn something about him in your workplace that you cannot learn here. When God appeared to Peter in the sea, it's a lesson that Peter never forgot because it was relevant. Sometimes I think we miss the opportunity for God to reveal himself to us in the context of where we live. Joel, come on up. I'm going to sing a closing song. Why not call out to God in the context of your job? Because here's the deal. Your work matters to God. Let me pray for us. Father, we looked at, when we look at work under the sun, it can seem fruitless. A lot of things look different under the sun. Not considering it from your perspective, work looks different. from that perspective, boy, death and dying sure looks different from that perspective. Think about those who have passed the hope of life on the other side of the grave, of reunions, recognitions, eternal existence, really changes the way we look at life. Can't imagine what it would be like to have lived at a time where the far side of the grave was dark, formless, void. Some thoughts and indications about something, but not clear, in the shadow. And Jesus, you brought immortality out of the shadow. What comfort that gives us as we think of those who have gone before us, those who have passed away, those who, knowing you, who have fallen asleep and woke in your presence. Thanks for the hope it gives us. We don't grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again. So we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. Thank you for the hope of immortality. Thanks, Jesus, for coming and telling us about it personally and demonstrating it personally so that we would have something solid to put this hope in Jesus' name. Amen.